Someone asks what you've been up to lately, and you give them the short version. Just some things I'm working on. Maybe a vague gesture at something in your life that you're genuinely invested in, a project, a decision, a change you're considering. But you don't go further than that. Not because you don't trust the person asking. Not because there's anything wrong with what you're doing. Just because something in you doesn't want it out there yet. Maybe not ever. Most people will read that as evasiveness, or they'll assume you don't feel close enough to them to share. But neither of those explanations quite fits what's actually happening. The psychology of people who genuinely don't like others knowing what they're doing is something more deliberate and more considered than it appears on the surface. And it's worth understanding clearly, because these people are consistently misread, and the misreading costs something. Let's start with the most basic misunderstanding. The default assumption when someone keeps their activities private is that they have something to hide. That the secrecy is defensive, a symptom of guilt, distrust, or social discomfort. We live in a culture that has come to treat sharing as the natural state and privacy as the deviation. If you're not posting about it, talking about it, or at least acknowledging it to the people around you, the question that follows almost automatically is, what are you hiding? But privacy and secrecy are not the same thing. And collapsing the two is where most people go wrong when they try to understand someone like this. Psychologists who study privacy as a psychological construct distinguish it clearly from concealment. Secrecy is about hiding something that would be problematic if known. Privacy is about maintaining ownership of something that simply hasn't been shared yet, and may not need to be. These people aren't building walls around something dangerous. They're drawing a line around something that belongs to them. What they're doing, what they're planning, what they're building, these things are theirs. Not secret, just private. Research on privacy as a fundamental psychological need, which goes back to the foundational work of theorists like Erwin Altman, consistently shows that the ability to control information about oneself is not a luxury or a personality quirk. It's a core component of psychological well-being. When people feel that others have access to their activities without their consent, they report higher stress, lower sense of agency, and a diminished feeling of self-ownership. The need to keep some things private isn't a pathology. It's a healthy assertion of where the self begins and ends. For people who operate this way, the line is simply drawn more visibly and more firmly than average. They've decided, consciously or not, that their inner world, their plans, their work in progress, their private endeavors, belongs to them until they choose to release it. And they don't feel any particular obligation to release it on someone else's schedule. Now let's talk about something that goes deeper than privacy as a general concept, and into the specific dynamics of what happens when other people know what you're doing. Knowledge creates access, and access, even well-intentioned access, changes things. When other people know what you're doing, they become participants in it, whether you invited them to be or not. They ask how it's going. They offer opinions. They track your progress in their minds and reflect their expectations back at you in small ways that are hard to pin down but easy to feel. And all of that creates pressure. Not hostile pressure, in most cases, but pressure nonetheless, the kind that accumulates quietly and begins to shape your choices without you fully noticing. Psychologists who study the relationship between goal disclosure and performance have found something genuinely counterintuitive. Sharing your intentions with others often undermines your ability to follow through on them. When you tell someone about a goal, the social acknowledgement of having stated it produces a small but measurable sense of premature completion. The talking about it registers to some part of the brain as a substitute for the doing of it. The motivation to actually complete the work is subtly reduced. But beyond the neuroscience, there's something more fundamental at stake: autonomy. The freedom to pursue something on your own terms, to change direction without explaining yourself, to fail without it being witnessed, to succeed quietly without having to perform the success for an audience, is something these people protect deliberately. When other people know what you're doing, you implicitly take on a small obligation to keep them updated. Your choices become answerable to an external audience in a way they weren't before. And for people who value their sense of self-direction highly, that shift is significant even when it seems minor from the outside. They're not being secretive. They're maintaining the conditions under which they can act freely. There's also something worth noting about the specific cost of unsolicited updates. When you tell someone you're working on something, you open a loop, and loops, in social dynamics, create an expectation of closure. The next time you see that person, the question is already waiting. How did it go? Did you follow through? What happened? Even if the person asking means well. You're now managing their expectations alongside your own process. For people who do their best work in unobserved space, that management is a tax they've decided they'd rather not pay. The third piece of this is perhaps the most telling and the most practical. These people have a clear-eyed understanding of what other people's awareness of their activities tends to produce. And the honest assessment is, usually noise. When people know what you're doing, they have opinions about it. Some of those opinions are useful. Most are not. They're filtered through the other person's own experiences, biases, fears, and projections, and have only a loose connection to your actual situation. A friend who failed at something similar will caution you. Someone who succeeded will oversimplify the path. Someone who doesn't fully understand what you're doing will give advice based on what they think you're doing. All of this creates static. Psychologists who study social influence and decision-making have documented this effect in detail. The mere knowledge that others are aware of and evaluating your work changes how you approach it, even when the evaluations are positive. External awareness introduces a performance dynamic that wasn't there before. You start making choices that take into account how things will look, or what you'll be able to report, rather than choices that purely serve the work itself. People who keep their activities private have usually figured this out, not from reading studies, but from accumulating enough experience to recognize the pattern in themselves. They've noticed that the projects they talked about early rarely ended up where they intended, that the ones they kept quiet moved faster, stayed truer to what they actually wanted, and arrived at better outcomes. That's not superstition. That's pattern recognition. People who keep their activities private have usually figured this out at a deeper level too, not from reading studies, but from paying attention to their own experience over time. They've noticed the particular way that other people's awareness of a project changes their relationship to it, the subtle way that having to explain what you're doing shapes what you end up doing. And they've decided reasonably and deliberately to keep that influence out. This isn't antisocial. They're not rejecting the people around them. They're protecting the clarity of their own judgment from inputs they didn't ask for and mostly don't need. So let's be honest about who these people actually are. They're not hiding anything. They're not distrustful. They're not people with something to prove by being mysterious. They are people who understand clearly that their activities are their own business, that other people's knowledge of those activities comes with consequences they haven't consented to, and that the opinions of others, however well-meaning, are more likely to interfere with their thinking than to improve it. In a culture that has come to treat visibility as virtue and privacy as something to be explained, these people are making a quiet but deliberate choice. Not everything that matters needs an audience. If that resonated, leave a comment. I'd like to hear your thoughts. I'll see you in the next video.